The thick wooden door of courtroom B swung open with a heavy groan, and a hush fell over the spectators. All eyes landed on the slight figure shuffling inside, flanked by two stone-faced bailiffs. Her name was Elena Petrova, a 17-year-old immigrant student whose face was as pale as the late autumn sky. She clutched a small leather folder to her chest, as though it were armor against the stairs, her big, dark eyes scanning the room for an ounce of kindness she might cling to, but there was none. Judge Armstrong sat perched behind the towering bench like a hawk on a precipice, peering down at Elena with an expression of outright skepticism. He was known for his booming voice and gruff manner, a man who found his power in leveling sharp remarks at anyone he deemed a waste of the court's time. Rumor had it he once made a witness faint from sheer intimidation, though he always laughed off that story when people recounted it. Today, as the crowd shifted in their seats, he did not hide his disdain. His lips curved into a mocking smile. "Would you look at that?" Judge Armstrong said in a drawl that dripped with condescension. "A quiet little thing, aren't you, barely tall enough to see over the defense table?" Laughter trickled from a few corners of the courtroom. Elena's cheeks burned, but she refused to avert her gaze. She had come too far to back down now. She thought of her family's journey, fleeing their troubled homeland, settling in a cramped apartment on the edge of Pinewood City, battling the constant fear of being uprooted again. All that was behind her, she told herself. This was her chance to set the record straight, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Judge Armstrong pounded his gavel once to restore order, though the smirk never left his face. "Let's see here," he went on, shuffling through papers on his desk. "Charged with accessing restricted educational records and breaching the city's scholarship database, is that it? Now, why would a sweet, polite young lady do a thing like that?" The sarcasm on the word lady brought a few more snickers. Elena's throat felt like it was packed with sand, but she summoned her courage. She opened the leather folder, hands trembling. Inside were sheets of documents she'd spent countless nights assembling. They were battered by now, smudged from the press of her fingertips. But each page was a piece of the puzzle that could explain everything, if only anyone would listen. She placed the documents in front of her on the defendant's table, clearing her throat. "Your Honor, with respect," she said, her accent faint but noticeable. "I did not hack those files to cause harm. I was trying to do the right thing." Before she could elaborate, the judge leaned forward, letting out a short, incredulous bark of laughter. "The right thing?" he echoed, his eyebrows shooting up. "Tell me, Mrs. Petrova, do you think violating federal privacy laws is the right thing?" A murmur rustled through the benches. Elena set her jaw, refusing to cower. "When the laws are misused to protect corruption, maybe they deserve to be challenged." A small gasp rippled among the spectators. The bailiffs exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Armstrong slowly rose from his seat, the look on his face as cold as a deep winter freeze. "I don't know what country you came from, Miss Petrova," he said, voice thick with implied insult, "but here we respect our judicial system. You sound like you think you're smarter than our entire legal framework." Elena stared up at him, her heart a pounding drumbeat. An older gentleman in the first row, perhaps an attorney from a different case, blinked at her, something like pity flickering across his face. But he stayed silent. "Your Honor," Elena began. Judge Armstrong cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I've seen plenty of self-righteous kids in my time. Let me guess, you're one of those whiz kids who believe they can outsmart everyone else, right? Maybe you read too many detective novels or watched too many conspiracies on television." A few more subdued chuckles echoed. Elena's shoulders tightened. For a moment she was tempted to clam up, to retreat into the protective shell that had shielded her all her life. But the memory of her mother's tear-stained face flashed in her mind, an immigrant parent doing double shifts at a factory, determined to see her only daughter succeed in a new land. Elena refused to let that sacrifice be trampled by anyone, not even a judge. She looked straight at Judge Armstrong with a calmness that made him pause. "I'm not outsmarting anyone," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm telling you that there's been a series of fraudulent activities targeting immigrant students in the city's scholarship program. If you'd give me a chance, I can show you the proof." It was as though a dark cloud passed over the judge's face. He flicked his gaze down to his clerk, who shrugged helplessly. Then Judge Armstrong let out a contemptuous laugh, the sound echoing off the paneled walls. "So you decided to break the law to expose it. You'll find that's not how our system works." A bead of sweat trickled down the side of Elena's face. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak another word, the massive double doors at the back of the room crashed open. A dozen men and women in suits rushed in, whispering to each other in urgent voices. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern look etched into his features. City Councilman Darren Holcomb, the very man Elena suspected of orchestrating the scholarship fraud. Holcomb stepped up to the front of the courtroom, ignoring the usual decorum, and whispered hurriedly to the judge. A hush fell again as everyone strained to catch a word. Judge Armstrong's face grew rigid, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. When Holcomb pulled back, the judge cleared his throat. "I've just been informed," he said, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom, "that there are ongoing city investigations that may relate to Ms. Petrova's claims, but this does not excuse her alleged criminal activities." Holcomb's dark eyes locked onto Elena like a hawk zeroing in on its prey. She felt a prickle of danger race down her spine. She knew it. Holcomb was desperate to shut her down before she could speak another word. She clutched her folder more tightly. Judge Armstrong tapped his gavel. "We will take a short recess to sort out these new details. Defendant will remain in custody until further notice." A swarm of murmurs broke out. The bailiffs moved closer to escort Elena away. She felt a wave of panic welling in her chest, but then she remembered something a teacher of hers had once said. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it." So she turned, meeting Holcomb's stare with a defiant glare of her own. She wasn't giving up, not now. The next hours were a whirlwind. The bailiffs led her through a sterile corridor to a small holding room that smelled of old coffee and stale air. She could still hear the judge's mocking tone in her mind, the quiet snickers of onlookers. She tried to keep her composure, but once she was alone in that cramped space, the gravity of her situation settled on her like a weighty blanket. She was just a teenager, an immigrant, and no one believed her. Was it hopeless? Yet the flicker of determination in her heart refused to go out. This was bigger than just a single court hearing. She'd discovered the unsettling truth about a scholarship program that was supposed to champion bright immigrant students, only to see that the funds were being siphoned away, forging awards for phantom students, and funneling money into pockets of officials who never expected a shy girl to notice the discrepancies. And now that she'd tried to expose it, Holcomb and his allies were doing everything in their power to silence her. She was lost in those thoughts when the door swung open. A short, bespectacled woman in a rumpled blazer stepped inside. "I'm Nancy Rhodes," the woman said quietly, offering a handshake. "I'm a public defender assigned to your case." Elena felt a surge of relief at the gentle tone. She shook Nancy's hand. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I'm not sure anyone believes me." Nancy nodded, dropping her voice. "I took a quick look at your file. Listen, I don't want you to say anything self-incriminating, but if you have evidence of wrongdoing, you need to show it to me. Right now." Elena opened the battered folder. Page after page of spreadsheets, transaction histories, suspicious bank accounts. Nancy's eyes widened as she flipped through them. "This? How did you get this?" A pang of anxiety tugged at Elena's stomach. "I volunteer at the community center. They give seminars about scholarship opportunities, so I started reviewing these records to help new immigrant families. But I saw anomalies. Large sums missing, recipients who didn't exist. Then I recognized some real students being denied their rightful scholarships. I hacked in to confirm my suspicions." Nancy's expression turned serious. "Okay, that's going to complicate the legal side of things, but it also might blow the lid off something huge. Did you share this with anyone else?" Elena shook her head. "No one believed me. Then Holcomb's office started sending me threatening letters to stop poking around. That's when I realized how serious this was." Nancy's gaze hardened. "I might be able to file a motion that reveals this new evidence to the court in a formal way, but Holcomb's powerful. He's got connections everywhere." She stopped short, glancing anxiously over her shoulder as though the walls themselves might have ears. "Look, I have to make a call. Don't lose hope." She left, the door locking behind her. Elena sat there, alone, the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead driving her deeper into anxious thoughts. She remembered an old saying she'd once heard: "It is often in the darkest skies that we see the brightest stars." The words whispered to her now, giving her a delicate thread of comfort. She closed her eyes and reminded herself, no matter the odds, she had to keep fighting. Recess dragged on. Eventually a bailiff led Elena back into the courtroom, which was still abuzz with tension. Holcomb was nowhere to be seen, but she sensed his invisible hand in every corner. Judge Armstrong shuffled his papers, clearing his throat as if to remind everyone he was still in charge. "Are we ready to proceed?" he growled, glancing down at Nancy, who stood by Elena's side. Nancy addressed the court with as much confidence as she could muster. "Your Honor, my client has come into possession of evidence that suggests widespread corruption in the city's scholarship programs. I'd like to submit these documents for review and request that Ms. Petrova's charges be reconsidered." A wave of murmurs rose. The older gentleman in the gallery shifted forward in his seat, eyes fixed on Elena with newfound interest. Judge Armstrong tapped his gavel. Once, twice, quieting the rumble. "Well, I'll be," he said dryly. "The quiet foreign girl claims to have discovered a major scandal all by her lonesome." Eleanor's hand instinctively went to the folder and Nancy passed the packet to the clerk. Judge Armstrong began leafing through the data, his frown deepening. This is quite the pile of allegations," he muttered. Nancy seized the moment. "Your Honor, if this is true, it's a matter of public interest that dwarfs the severity of my client's alleged hacking. I request the opportunity to present expert testimony and to have these records analyzed by a forensic accountant." The judge's eyes flicked toward Elena, and for the first time she thought she saw a hint of uncertainty behind his mask of arrogance. But then he set the pages aside, leaning back in his chair with a huff. "This is a court of law, Ms. Rhodes, not a stage for conspiracy theories." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but Nancy placed a calming hand on her arm. Before the judge could pronounce his next words, the courtroom doors burst open yet again. This time it was a young police officer, flushed and disheveled, practically sprinting down the aisle. He stopped at the front, gasping. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe Ms. Petrova may be in danger. Just received a tip there's a credible threat on her life." The collective gasp that swept the room was like a gust of wind. Judge Armstrong's face contorted. He glanced over at the officer. "Danger? At the courthouse?" "That's correct, sir," the officer replied, voice shaking. "There could be an attempt on her life. Today." A jolt of raw fear coursed through Elena. Danger? She considered Holcomb's menacing figure, the hush-hush conversations, the intimidation she'd received by mail. It made perfect sense. She'd uncovered a money trail worth millions, and now those behind it would stop at nothing to keep her quiet. The judge pressed his lips together, weighing the new information. With a reluctant sigh, he turned to Nancy. "Due to these extraordinary circumstances, the court will temporarily stay the proceedings. Miss Petrova, you're to be placed under protective custody until such threats can be evaluated." For a moment, Elena let out the breath she'd been holding. At least that meant she wouldn't be carted off to some detention facility. But the reality of needing protection, a potential target, sent her heart racing all over again. No sooner had Judge Armstrong made his announcement than an ear-splitting bang echoed from outside the corridor. Shouts rang out, and a wave of panic swept the gallery. One of the bailiffs rushed to the door, only to stumble back with a bullet hole ripped through his sleeve. Gunfire. People screamed, diving under benches or scrambling to the exits. Nancy pulled Elena down behind the defense table, her eyes wild with fear. "Stay down," she hissed. The older gentleman from the gallery ducked behind a row of seats, his mouth agape at the chaos. The judge hammered his gavel in a futile attempt at control, but the sound was drowned out by more shots echoing in the corridor. Elena's mind reeled. This was no random act of violence. Someone had come for her, right here, in front of everyone. She remembered all the threatened lawsuits, the menacing phone calls, the private letters full of vile intimidation. It seemed unimaginable that city officials, or the criminals they employed, would resort to open gunfire in a courthouse. But the truth was tearing reality apart. Nancy clutched Elena's arm. "We have to get you out of here," she said in a near-silent whisper. A side door slammed open and a cluster of armed officers rushed in, shouting commands. Smoke from a tear gas canister started wafting in from the hallway. It stung Elena's eyes, forcing her to blink rapidly. Over the noise, she heard a snarl of pain as someone out of sight was tackled to the floor. For a moment, time suspended. She remembered a quote her mother once loved. "In the darkest times, the light of truth shines the brightest." Could that be true now? Had her pursuit of truth ignited something unstoppable? She felt a sudden yank on her shoulder. It was one of the officers in full tactical gear, beckoning her out from behind the table. Nancy nodded. "Go, I'll find you later." Elena stumbled to her feet, choking on the acrid tang of the gas, and followed the officer through a chaos of running figures, overturned benches, and frightened bystanders. Another officer shielded them from potential gunfire, though it seemed the shooter, whoever it was, had been subdued. They whisked Elena down a back hallway she'd never seen, rushing her past dozens of side offices and storing chambers, until they reached a small exit that opened onto a secure parking area at the rear of the courthouse. A black SUV stood waiting, engine idling. An older detective with sharp eyes sat behind the wheel, 2 more armed escorts in the vehicle. The officer practically shoved Elena into the back seat, then climbed in beside her. "Drive!" he roared. The detective hit the gas, tires squealing, as they sped off into the city's winding streets. Elena craned her neck to see if anyone was following, but the tinted windows revealed only glimpses of passing cars and tall city buildings. Adrenaline surged through her veins, and tears she'd refused to let out earlier now pricked at her eyes. She was overwhelmed, fearful, determined, and angry all at once. One of the armed escorts pulled off his helmet, revealing a worried face marked by deep lines of experience. "My name's Officer Tanaka," he said gently. "I know this is scary, but you're safe now. We've got instructions to keep you protected until we figure out what's going on." Elena's voice trembled. "Who was shooting back there?" He exchanged a glance with the driver. "We're still getting details, but we suspect it's related to the corruption you exposed. Someone really wanted to silence you." She shivered involuntarily. "What about Nancy and the judge?" Officer Tanaka sighed. "We got word Nancy Rhodes is fine. The judge is shaken but unharmed. We'll handle your legal proceedings once we can ensure your safety." They drove in tense silence for a while. Elena pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the cityscape race by. Pinewood City was a place of contradictions, shining skyscrapers overshadowing rundown blocks where families like hers struggled to get by. She couldn't help but feel a pang of homesickness for her old country, even though life there had been hard. At least no one had tried to kill her for simply speaking the truth. The SUV eventually turned down an unmarked road that led to a secluded safe house, a modest brick structure hidden behind tall hedges. Armed guards stood at the entrance, letting the vehicle pass with curt nods. They ushered Elena inside, into a living area sparsely furnished with a couch, a table, and minimal decor. No windows in the main space, just thick walls and a sense of isolation that made her uneasy. Officer Tanaka guided her to a small side room, illuminated by a single desk lamp. "We'll stay here for the night. You'll be safe. Get some rest if you can," he said, though the expression on his face suggested he doubted she'd find any. Alone in the dimly lit room, Elena sank onto the couch, tension coiling in every muscle. She clenched her fists, recalling the horror of the courthouse, the judge's belittling sneers, Holcomb's menacing stare, and the spatter of gunshots that almost claimed her life. She was merely a high school student who had stumbled upon a monstrous conspiracy. At least now the police believed her enough to protect her. That was something. Time crept like a snail. Sleep was a distant possibility as she paced the cramped quarters. She turned on the desk lamp and carefully laid out her documents, reviewing them for the 1,000th time. Each line of data told a story of stolen funds, false identities, bribes. And the more she studied it, the more she realized how deep this corruption likely ran. It wasn't just Councilman Holcomb. There had to be others, powerful people with connections high above. She thought of her mother, who was probably pacing the living room of their modest apartment, frantic with worry, having only heard that something terrible happened at the courthouse. Tears threatened Elena's composure again, but she bit them back, telling herself, "Crying doesn't help." Another quote from her mother echoed, "Tears water the seeds of determination." Maybe it was all right to cry if it fueled her resolve. In a moment of clarity, she remembered the sealed envelope in her backpack. The letter of acceptance to Northbridge University, a prestigious institution renowned for cutting-edge science and technology programs. She had applied in a desperate, hopeful rush 6 months ago, never expecting to actually be admitted, let alone with a major scholarship. When the acceptance finally came, it felt like a dream. She was counting on the city scholarship to cover the rest of the fees, to help her mother keep food on the table. But after discovering the massive fraud, she suspected that official scholarship might be withheld or sabotaged. Now, ironically, her unstoppable curiosity about the scholarship records had placed her in mortal peril. She reached into her bag and pulled out that precious envelope, carefully smoothing the creases. She traced her finger over the bold print of her name. Elena Petrova. For a fleeting second, she imagined what life would be like on that bustling, intellectually vibrant campus. Lectures by world-class professors, a library stacked with every book she'd ever dreamed of reading, meeting fellow students who shared her passion for solving big problems. A flicker of excitement warmed her chest. She vowed not to let these criminals rob her of that future. A gentle knock on the door startled her. Officer Tanaka poked his head in. "Someone here to see you?" he said, a note of curiosity in his voice. Elena hastily tucked the acceptance letter away. She looked up to see Nancy Rhodes stepping into the room, hair disheveled, her blouse wrinkled. She looked like she'd just sprinted a marathon. Relief washed over Elena. "You're okay?" Nancy offered a quick smile. "I am, but concerned about you. How are you holding up?" Elena shrugged, emotion twisting in her chest. "Still alive, I guess. That's something." Nancy sank onto a folding chair, dropping her worn briefcase by her feet. "Things are heating up fast. Holcomb has denied any involvement, of course. But I've filed an immediate motion to turn over all evidence in front of a federal judge. This is beyond the scope of local courts now." Elena's pulse quickened. "A federal judge?" "Yes," Nancy said. "If the corruption is as systemic as your documents suggest, we need to bypass local jurisdictions entirely. Too many of them might be compromised." Elena swallowed. "That means a bigger fight, right?" Nancy nodded, her gaze full of empathy. "Yes, but it also means you'll have more powerful allies. The FBI is likely to get involved." It was a lot to take in. Elena exhaled slowly. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice trembling. "I never asked for any of this." Nancy reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I know, Elena. But you did the right thing. You might have saved countless deserving students from being defrauded. They talked late into the night, conferring with Officer Tanaka about the next steps. Nancy explained that a preliminary federal hearing would be set up as soon as possible, and Elena would need to testify. As the clock ticked past midnight, exhaustion pressed heavily on Elena, yet her mind buzzed with frantic energy. When morning came, bright sunlight peeked through a tiny window near the ceiling. Elena looked in the mirror, noticing the dark rings under her eyes, the frazzled state of her hair. No matter, she straightened her shoulders and prepared for the next ordeal, determined not to let fear define her. Officer Tanaka led her out to a new vehicle, a discreet sedan this time. No sirens, no tinted bulletproof windows, just an unremarkable car meant to blend into traffic. Nancy slid into the back seat beside Elena, while Tanaka took the passenger seat, and another officer, Ramirez, drove. The plan was to head straight to the federal building across town for a secured briefing. The city streets glistened with last night's rain, early commuters hustling along sidewalks with cups of coffee in hand. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Just a girl traveling across town. But every time the sedan paused at a red light, Elena's chest tightened. She half expected to see a black SUV with tinted windows pulling up behind them, or a gunman on a motorcycle weaving through traffic. After a tense 30-minute drive, they arrived at the federal building, a fortress of gray concrete and glass, bristling with security cameras. Armed guards at the gate checked ID and waved them through. Inside the lobby, tall metal detectors and uniformed officers guided them toward a private elevator. Elena's heart pounded anew. She'd never been somewhere so imposing. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, revealing a warren of offices and conference rooms. Nancy led Elena into a room with a long mahogany table and thick blinds over the windows. 3 men and 1 woman in dark suits stood as they entered, each wearing a government badge. The oldest among them, a gray-haired man with piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Special Agent Monroe," he said, offering Elena a handshake. "We've reviewed the basic outline of your case. Thank you for coming." Elena forced a polite nod, though her nerves felt frayed. She perched on the edge of a seat, that leather folder never leaving her hands. The other agents introduced themselves quickly. Task Force on Government Integrity, and turned their attention to Elena as though she were the key witness in a grand-scale investigation, which apparently she was. One by one, they peppered her with questions. "How did you discover the anomalies? Did anyone else assist you? How certain are you that the data you gathered is accurate?" Elena responded as best she could, her anxiety rising every time she stumbled over her words. Nancy occasionally interjected to clarify. Finally, Special Agent Monroe asked, "Do you have any idea how high this might go?" Elena swallowed. "Councilman Holcomb is my main suspect, but his circle, I'm not sure." Monroe tapped a pen against his notepad. "We suspect there's a ring of officials colluding to funnel millions in scholarship funds into personal slush accounts. If you're correct, this is no small matter. It might tie to broader embezzlement across various city departments." Elena's hands shook. Her imagination conjured shadows in every hallway. She took a shaky breath and met Monroe's gaze. "If I help, can you protect me?" Monroe nodded gravely. "We'll do everything in our power, but you need to be prepared. This is going to draw immense scrutiny. Once you testify, your identity and involvement become public record. People who want to silence you might try again." Her stomach clenched. "I understand," she whispered, voice just barely steady. She thought of that acceptance letter once more. Could she even think about her bright future, if dangerous criminals were lurking, waiting to strike? Nancy placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "We'll proceed carefully, one step at a time." The hours that followed were a blur of legal formalities and security protocols. Elena recounted her discovery, the patterns in the data, the threats she'd received. She handed over all her meticulously documented proof. Watching the agents sift through the pages with serious faces gave her a grim sense of validation. At least they believed her now. By late afternoon, the meeting adjourned. Monroe escorted them to a secure hallway, updating them on the next steps. A hearing was set for 2 days later, where Elena would present her testimony to a federal judge. Elena's breath caught in her throat, but she nodded her assent. "I'll do what I have to," she said softly. Nancy glanced at her watch. "We should get you somewhere safe." Monroe concurred. "We have a specialized witness protection suite on the top floor. You'll stay there until the hearing." Elena followed Nancy and Officer Tanaka to an elevator that rose even higher. Opening onto a smaller, more isolated corridor, the suite was modest but comfortable. 2 rooms, each with a bed, a small kitchenette, and security cameras in the hallway. A place to rest, if she could calm her ever-spinning thoughts. At last, behind the locked door of her assigned room, Elena collapsed onto the bed. She was exhausted, mentally drained. She half-heartedly ate a sandwich from the kitchenette, then rummaged through her backpack again, finding that acceptance letter. This time she dared to read it in full, letting each word wash over her like a balm. "Congratulations. It is with great pleasure that we offer you admission to Northbridge University, with a merit-based scholarship covering 80% of your tuition. Your academic record and passion for scientific research have impressed our admissions committee." Tears welled up as she clutched the letter. She whispered to the empty room, "I'm not going to lose this chance." It felt like a promise. To herself, to her mother, and maybe to every other immigrant student out there who fought for a fair shot. She drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by visions of the courthouse shooting, Holcomb's sneering face, and the unspoken threat that seemed to loom over every corner of her life. In her dreams, she kept hearing an older voice, wise and gentle, saying, "When justice sleeps, it is every good person's duty to awaken it." Morning arrived in a blur of buzzing phones and urgent knocks. Nancy brought coffee and a reassuring smile. "Today we finalize your testimony with the federal prosecutors," she explained. "Then, tomorrow is the big day." Elena stared at the steaming cup in her hand, trying to steady her nerves. "Do you really think we can win this?" Nancy's eyes softened. "I do, because you have truth on your side." Those words steadied Elena more than she cared to admit. She squared her shoulders, determined to see this through. By 9 o'clock, they were in a small conference room down the hall. Federal prosecutors, stern but courteous, walked her through each point of evidence, preparing her for the defense's potential counterarguments. They commended her diligence and her unusual expertise in data analysis. When they asked how she learned to spot these irregularities, she explained her fascination with numbers and patterns. "They're universal," she said, "like a language that doesn't care about borders." They continued until evening, ensuring every detail was airtight. Elena's mind was spinning with details of dates, times, suspicious bank codes. She felt a flicker of confidence in her own abilities, despite the fear swirling in her chest. She truly was the only one who could connect the dots, and she planned to do it perfectly. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Nancy walked Elena back to the protective suite. She paused outside the door. "You remind me of my daughter," she said softly. "About the same age. She always says, 'If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.' That's how you're living right now, Elena." Elena's eyes stung with tears she refused to shed. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm just doing what anyone should." The night stretched on, each tick of the clock a reminder of the hearing drawing closer. Anxiety gnawed at Elena, but she found solace in writing down personal notes, everything she wished she could say if she had a bigger audience. She penned statements about the struggles immigrant families face, how scholarships can change entire destinies, and how criminal corruption can rob them of hope. It was more than a legal matter. It was about the spirit of fairness she had always believed in. Finally, dawn broke. This was the day. The hearing would begin at 10. She dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, feeling strangely adult as she looked in the mirror. Nancy appeared at her door, nodding with approval. "Time to go," she said, voice steady. A small motorcade escorted them to the federal courthouse. Different from the local one, larger, with an imposing facade. They moved through security checks that were even stricter than the day before. Elena's heart hammered when she passed the metal detectors, half expecting some calamity, but no shots rang out this time, no dramatic intrusion. They made it inside safely. In the long corridor outside the assigned courtroom, she paused to gather her breath. Nancy whispered words of encouragement, and Special Agent Monroe gave a curt nod. "We have units watching the perimeter," he assured her. "If Holcomb or any of his associates try something, they'll be met with full federal response." Elena inhaled deeply. She could do this. She stepped through the door into a hushed, formal setting, rows of pew-like benches, a raised bench for the judge, the hum of ventilation overhead. The judge, a slender woman in her late 50s, regarded Elena with cautious but polite attention. Her nameplate read Anne Valerie Ortiz. After procedural introductions, Judge Ortiz turned her gaze on Elena. "Mrs. Petrova, please approach." Elena did, her throat tight. She placed one hand on the Bible for the oath, though in her mind she prayed in whatever universal sense existed. When finished, she took her seat at the witness stand, every muscle tensed. One of the federal prosecutors guided her through her testimony, allowing Elena to explain her entire process. How she volunteered at the community center, how she noticed suspicious patterns, how she traced them to Councilman Holcomb's networks, how she'd hacked the system in an attempt to confirm wrongdoing. She displayed the meticulously saved records on a projector screen, a labyrinth of transactions and forged student names. The judge leaned forward with keen interest, the silent audience following every word. Cameras were not allowed, so the press had to rely on written notes and sketches, but Elena could still feel the weight of the entire city's gaze on her. Halfway through her presentation, the doors opened, and a cluster of men in expensive suits entered, settling into the defense side. Councilman Holcomb was among them. He wore an expression of icy composure, but Elena could sense his anger pulsing like an aura. He never took his eyes off her, and she felt a chill course through her spine. She forced herself to keep speaking, remembering all the hours she'd prepared for this very moment. Then came the cross-examination. A tall, thin attorney with a sneer that reminded her of Judge Armstrong approached, flipping through pages of notes. "Miss Petrova," he began with forced politeness, "would you agree that you illegally accessed restricted data belonging to the Scholarship Administration?" Her stomach clenched. "Yes, I did." He seized on that admission. "So by your own testimony, you're a criminal, correct?" Some in the audience snickered, reminiscent of the old mocking voices. Elena took a measured breath. "I broke the law to expose a larger crime. If being a criminal means preventing millions of dollars from being stolen from immigrant students, then I can't say I regret it." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The attorney rolled his eyes, pressing on. "Isn't it convenient that you, an untrained high school student, claim to have discovered something that professional auditors and city officials never spotted?" She felt the heat in her cheeks. "I'm not untrained," she said, controlling her tone. "I'm self-taught. Numbers are my specialty. Patterns speak to me. And as for the officials not spotting it, maybe they didn't want to." A ripple of tension soared through the room like electricity. Holcomb shifted in his seat, clearly displeased. Judge Ortiz rapped her gavel lightly for order, then fixed the defense attorney with a measured stare. "Counsel, proceed." The cross-examination continued with barbed questions, aiming to paint Elena as an impulsive teenager with a vendetta, but every time she answered calmly, methodically. She'd rehearsed this scenario, anticipating each angle of attack. By the end, the defense's sneers felt hollow. Finally, the judge signaled for a break. She stepped out briefly, and Elena sank back on the witness bench, her heart hammering. Nancy offered a discreet thumbs up from across the aisle. The tension was suffocating, but Elena felt an undercurrent of victory. When the judge returned, she allowed the prosecution to present supplementary evidence, bank statements and logs from the scholarship system servers, all of which corroborated Elena's claims. Councilman Holcomb's face turned a shade paler, though he tried to maintain a calm facade. The hush in the courtroom was palpable. The judge scanned the final piece of evidence, each page turning with a crisp, accusatory flutter. At length, Judge Ortiz looked up, eyes clear and direct. "Miss Petrova, based on the evidence presented, it appears you've unearthed a potentially vast network of fraud. While your methods of discovery may have involved unauthorized access, the substance of your findings warrants immediate investigation at the highest levels." Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. The judge was acknowledging the validity of her claims. Openly, on the record? The judge continued. "As for the charges against Ms. Petrova, this court is inclined to place them on hold pending the outcome of the corruption investigation. In fact, I'm issuing a federal injunction to freeze the relevant city accounts and to bar Councilman Holcomb from overseeing any scholarship funds until further notice. A separate grand jury may be convened to examine possible criminal charges against those implicated." A low uproar spread through the audience. One of Holcomb's associates shot to his feet, mouth open in protest, but the judge silenced him with a warning glare. "This court will not tolerate corruption in any form, nor will it punish a citizen who has risked her own safety to expose it. Ms. Petrova will remain under protective status." Elena's entire body felt suddenly weightless, as though the shackles around her future had dissolved. She couldn't help the wave of emotion that crashed over her. Her eyes stung with tears, but for once, they were tears of triumph. With a final bang of the gavel, the hearing concluded. Journalists and onlookers flooded the aisles, peppering Elena with questions, snapping pictures of her face. She shielded her eyes, letting Nancy and the officers guide her through the chaos. Councilman Holcomb stood off to one side, fists clenched, his face a storm of fury. She spared him only a single glance, one that said, "You lost." Outside, the morning sun was blinding. Reporters clamored at the courthouse steps. Nancy put an arm around Elena's shoulders protectively, trying to steer her toward a waiting car. Officer Tanaka reappeared, scowling at the throng of cameras. "Give her space," he barked. "Petrova," a reporter shouted. "Any comment on how it feels to be a hero?" That word made Elena pause. A hero? She remembered cowering in that holding cell, the flight through gunfire, the nightmares. She was no superhero. She was just a teenager who refused to let injustice stand. But as she gazed at the camera lenses and the swarm of curious faces, a burst of steely determination filled her chest. "I'm just grateful that the truth is coming out," she said at last, voice trembling yet resolute. "No one should steal from those who already struggle. Immigrants come here seeking hope, not betrayal." A wave of murmurs and nods passed through the journalists. Flashes popped. Elena felt Nancy tug her gently. Time to go. They pushed through the crowd, stepping into the waiting sedan. The door slammed shut, and a wave of both exhaustion and relief washed over Elena. She exhaled shakily, glancing at Nancy. "It's over?" "Not entirely," Nancy said. "There will be more legal battles. But for you, at least, the worst is behind you." Elena nodded, tears threatening again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from her mother. "I saw on the news, I'm so proud of you, my brave girl," it read. She pressed the phone to her heart, smiling through the blur of fresh tears. She looked out the window, the city rolling past, feeling like it was all new. Pinewood City might still be a place of contradictions, but now it was also a place where her voice had made a difference. That afternoon, after a few more hours of formalities, Elena was told she could return home under federal protection. They drove her to her mother's apartment building. She stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk, heart fluttering with anticipation. The front door of the complex flew open, and her mother rushed out, arms outstretched. Elena nearly fell into her mother's embrace. "Are you all right?" her mother kept asking in their native language, hands trembling over Elena's cheeks, hair, shoulders. "You're safe now?" "I am," Elena whispered, tears flowing at last. "I am." Days passed, and though the immediate danger had subsided, Elena was still cautious. News broke that Holcomb had been indicted based on her evidence, leading to multiple arrests in the city government. The headlines read, "Immigrant teen exposes major scholarship fraud. Brave student sparks federal probe," and even "How a quiet high schooler shook up City Hall." For Elena, it was surreal. Then, one afternoon, Nancy arrived with a wide grin. "Guess what came in the mail from the federal prosecutor's office? The official notice dropping all charges against you. They've recognized your role as a whistleblower, so you won't face criminal liability." Elena's cheeks split into a radiant smile, but her heart soared even higher when Nancy continued, "And your scholarship to Northbridge University is safe. In fact, several philanthropic foundations have reached out. They want to ensure you have full funding." She couldn't speak for a moment, tears threatening again. Her mother beamed, hugging her so tightly it almost hurt. That evening they celebrated with a simple meal, just the two of them, the tension of the last few weeks replaced by cautious relief. A week later, Elena stepped onto the campus of Northbridge University for a special orientation invitation, her acceptance letter in her bag. The wide stone walkways, tall oak trees, and grand lecture halls took her breath away. She met with an admissions counselor who recognized her name from the news. "Your courage is inspiring," he told her, shaking her hand firmly. "We're honored to have you." Standing there in the middle of that bustling campus, Elena felt the promise of a life she had almost lost. In that moment, she recalled one more quote. One her mother used to say whenever times got hard. "What is meant for you will never pass you by." She believed it, deep in her soul. No matter how overwhelming the challenges, truth and perseverance had carried her here, and now her future shone with possibility. That very evening she found a quiet bench beneath a towering maple tree and took a moment to reflect on it all, the pain, the fear, the near tragedy, and the ultimate triumph. The memory of Judge Armstrong's mocking laughter flashed in her mind. She couldn't help but wonder how he felt now, knowing that the quiet immigrant student he'd tried to belittle had exposed the biggest scandal of his career. But that memory no longer hurt. It was just a stepping stone, part of a journey that taught her what it meant to fight for justice. She opened her phone and typed out a few lines, her personal reflection on what she'd learned. These were lessons she hoped others would find value in. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a quiet voice that refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. No matter how powerless you feel, the truth can be your shield. Trust that the light inside you is brighter than the darkness around you. At last she rose, inhaling the crisp evening air that carried the hint of the next chapter of her life. Yes, more challenges would come, but she was no longer the timid girl who flinched under a judge's scorn. She was Elena Petrova, an immigrant who dared to speak truth to power, a soon-to-be university student with dreams too strong to be stolen. And that, she thought with a smile curving her lips, was only the beginning. Percept. In the aftermath of her ordeal, Elena found herself reflecting on deeper life lessons, ones that transcended her personal story and could resonate with anyone who faced seemingly insurmountable odds. For those seeking meaning in her battle, she offered these insights. First, a single voice, when guided by conviction, can echo louder than an entire chorus. People often assume they are too small or insignificant to change anything, especially when large systems or powerful individuals are at play. But Elena learned that truth is a force multiplier. When you stand by it, it amplifies your voice beyond what you ever imagined possible. Second, fear is not the enemy, despair is. Throughout her journey, Elena was terrified, and yet that terror became fuel. It pushed her to act, to protect others, to demand transparency. Giving in to despair would have meant letting injustice fester unchecked. But channeling fear into action brought about real change. Third, we are each other's keepers. Elena was saved many times by Nancy Rhodes's legal expertise, by Officer Tanaka's protection, by the journalists who reported her story accurately. In turn, Elena's revelations saved countless students from a broken system. We survive and thrive by championing one another, even when the odds are stacked high. Finally, hope is born of truth, and truth of courage. This is the cornerstone upon which Elena now builds her life. She understands that the pursuit of truth, no matter how perilous, ultimately lights the path to a more just society. In a world that often feels dark, every courageous act, however small, is a beacon that guides us all forward. Those reflections would remain in Elena's heart as she stepped into her future, a future forged by her unwavering stand for justice. And in that future, she hoped everyone who heard her story might remember that the power to make a difference lives in each of us. It just needs the spark of courage to set it aflame.